Today, I'm super excited to have my colleague, Dr. Lyon, join to really focus on a topic that's of huge interest, I know, to this group on leveraging human-centered design to advance implementation science. So Dr. Lyon is a professor at the University of Washington's Department of Psychiatry, and he is co-director of the UW ALACRITY Center and the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, the SMART Center, both of which really leverage methods from human-centered design to support implementation of evidence-based practices in mental and behavioral health. He also directs a research institute for implementation science and education, which is called RISE, which I've heard amazing things about. And he's associate editor for the Journal of Implementation Research and Practice, which was launched a couple years ago. And he does amazing work. I have been following his work for a long time, and it's amazing to see what he has really accomplished in school settings with this work. So I'm really excited for everyone to hear from him today, and I will hand it over.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And it's fun to see a few familiar faces out there. Good. So like Rachel was saying, I'm lucky enough to co-lead the SMART Center, along with Jill Locke and Eric Bruns, the ALACRITY Center, along with Sean Munson and Pat Arian, at the ALACRITY Center, which is sort of the work that is most proximal to this talk today, although we kind of pull from human-centered design methods in both places. Our work is really driven by the idea that we can do adaptation better. And this is adaptation of both complex interventions and implementation strategies. And I'll be talking today about how human-centered design, aka user-centered design, aligns with and can augment implementation science. Couple of acknowledgements, some NIMH funding that's most relevant to this, including, fingers crossed, a pending renewal for our UW ALACRITY Center so we can keep all the fun going. I want to start just sort of with my main takeaways. These are that the world is designed and can be better designed, that human-centered design and implementation science have overlapping objectives, but different foci. And that there are opportunities to better integrate them, and certainly some things left to figure out. First, I just want to begin by pointing out that design problems are everywhere. This is a classic example of problematic design. If you approach something as simple as a door and you need a sign to tell you how to use it, that's a design problem. Taking your eyes off the road too long or too often could cause a crash, resulting in injury or death for you or others. Focus your attention on driving, and hopefully you're still alive by the time you're done reading this. It's a well-known fact that you must spin a USB 3 times before it will fit. Another classic example of problematic design, which we've partially overcome now that we've sort of moved into the world of USB-C. But before that, we could deduce that a USB has 3 states: the up position, the down position, and the superposition. And it will, of course, remain in the superposition until observed. So these are all just sort of common examples of problematic design that fall into this sort of the general arena of human-centered design. Although, you know, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. These are listed in no particular order, and similar to implementation science, where we talk about these multiple sort of overlapping terms: implementation science, knowledge translation, knowledge utilization, scaling science, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have the same kind of phenomenon happening in human-centered design. Co-design, user interface design, human-computer interaction, design thinking, human factors engineering. Some people will argue to the death about which one of these is the broader umbrella term, but I'm not one of those people. I use the term human-centered design in part because a lot of my colleagues do here at the University of Washington in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. This is a pretty generic human-centered design framework that pulls from some of the work at the International Standards Organization and other places. And all of these kind of iterative models for human-centered design begin with identifying a need, understanding the context in which sort of what you might ultimately design is going to be deployed, specifying your users and the user needs, and then iteratively developing and evaluating your designs until you've met those requirements or contextual kind of needs. Building understanding and empathy for people in the real world is also a key component of human-centered design, and there are sort of some ways that we attempt to make that happen. As you've likely already gathered, human-centered design and implementation science share some common objectives. They're both about the adoption of new innovations. They're both really about iteratively solving real-world problems. And they're both focused on multiple stakeholders or constituents and individual behavior ultimately, and trying to affect that. But they go about it a little bit differently. Implementation science has, at least historically, had a pretty major emphasis on maintaining innovation fidelity, although I think that there is more flexibility these days than there was 5-10 years ago. Whereas human-centered design changes the innovation first and foremost to meet local needs. Implementation science has many strategies that often strive to actually affect and change the organizational setting. Human-centered design evaluates but rarely seeks to change that setting. An exception would be sort of systems engineering and service design, but that's a relatively kind of small little corner of the broader human-centered design universe. Similar points about the overlap were made in a good paper by Chen et al. A little while back, with implementation science sort of contributing broad multi-level frameworks and human-centered design contributing more specific user-focused methods that can really achieve some of those goals. There's a really useful paper led by my good colleague Alex Dopp a little while back as well, that detailed 30 human-centered design strategies that could be used by people in the implementation space. The human-centered design strategies covered sort of different system levels, attended to the innovation level more than our standard set of implementation strategies, right? With an implementation, we have strategies that tend to focus most on individuals and the inner setting, whereas human-centered design brings a lot of innovation-focused strategies. Drawing largely from that, this is a slide I put together non-empirically categorizing human-centered design techniques along sort of a spectrum of, is it about information gathering or is it about sort of explicit design or redesign processes? So we have things like field observations, right? Some of these, may be pretty familiar to you if you spend a lot of time within the implementation space. But, observe the settings in which an innovation will be used to gather information about everyday activities, et cetera. User interviews, co-creation sessions, a little more design-oriented, convening potential users from the community you're serving and have them design an innovation prototype alongside you. We have things like live prototyping, iterative development, so sort of progressive refinement of an innovation through a cyclical approach, and all sorts of others. Just to sort of get a good sense of the kind of landscape that we're talking about. So how integrated are human-centered design and implementation science? There was another great paper done by Alex Dopp that looked at this and it was an online study with experts from both human-centered design and implementation. And it was a concept mapping task looking at human-centered design strategies and a subset of strategies from the ERIC compilation, which we all know and love. And it selected a final set of 10 clusters to sort of demonstrate the degree of alignment across core practices. And the answer is that not particularly well aligned. 3 of the 10 strategy clusters were transdisciplinary. There were 5 implementation-only clusters at the top and 2 human-centered design-only clusters at the bottom. So we potentially have work to do if we're looking to see, to sort of figure out how best to integrate the 2. But the flip side of that, and I think the positive reframe, is that there's a whole lot of opportunity for really complementary work and augmenting one another's fields. When we're talking about human-centered design targets for implementation. Most often, not always, but most often, I think we're talking about one of three things that we've sort of termed health services research products. There's our evidence-based psychosocial interventions in the mental health space. These wind up being things like cognitive behavioral therapy or applied behavior analysis or parent training protocols. There's also digital technologies, devices, wearables, mobile health apps, etc. And there's also implementation strategies, right? Whether it's a leadership-oriented training, whether it like LOSI, that Greg Ahrens and Mark Earhart have advanced so far, or post-training consultation, or even an initial education meeting. All of these things can be better designed and can be subjected to evaluation to determine how well they are designed. When we're talking about both intervention and implementation strategy design problems, those are the two main things I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to focus less on digital technologies, in part because I feel like digital technologies already get a good amount of play when we're talking about human-centered design processes. So the things that are most interesting to me tend to be more of the complex psychosocial processes that are either our interventions or our implementation strategies. And these could really suffer from both over-design and under-design. So over-design, that we create things sometimes inadvertently that are complicated and infeasible, and often require the replacement of existing practices rather than perhaps their augmentation. And then we also have under-design, sometimes the view that things are inflexible, or at least perceived to be, and maybe inadequately responsive to novel contexts. And the reason this is a problem is because problematic design limits scalability of all manner of interventions or innovations. And obviously, the public health impact of a lot of our interventions in mental health and all sorts of other domains are limited by their inconsistent application. I don't need to define implementation science for all of you, but what I do want to point out is that the design of both interventions or strategies, I would argue, is an underappreciated implementation determinant of adoption and use. I think that idea is reflected in this quote from a paper of Greg Ahrens back in 2017. For all types of scaling out, it may be possible to use the identical EDI. However, we more often need to adapt the intervention to fit the new population or new delivery system. And that's why I think we have arrived over the past little while within implementation in the science of adaptation. And I think a growing recognition that there is no implementation without adaptation. Sometimes it happens for reasons that are inadvertent and can be problematic, and sometimes it can be done strategically in order to improve the implementability or scalability of the thing, right? I mean, here's the CFIR, of course, and one of the things I like about the CFIR is just how explicit it is about how there is no implementation without adaptation. CFIR, of course, kind of differentiates between core components and adaptable periphery. As a quick aside, as if we always know what those are. We often don't. But the recognition that nothing is going to be implemented without demonstrating some amount of change. You can plan for it, or you can let it happen, but it's going to happen. Adaptation is also critical for access to some of our highest quality interventions. Obviously, we have low availability of some evidence-based interventions in community contexts, and that's often due to intervention complexity and poor contextual fit, especially true in mental health and in non-specialty settings where marginalized or minoritized communities are most likely to receive care. I do a lot of my work in schools, which is the most common setting for youth receipt of mental health services, and they're particularly important for enabling service access for historically underserved populations. But again, as I was sort of commenting on earlier, adaptations can be proactive or they can be reactive. And there's at least an assumption that more proactive adaptation is likely going to have more positive effects. This kind of undergirds a framework, which is not an implementation framework. We all know we have enough of those. This is an intervention implementation strategy redesign framework that is really just a more specific articulation of the general kind of generic human-centered design framework that I was talking about earlier. This is at the UW ALACRITY Center, NIMH-funded ALACRITY Center, where we've put together what we call the Discover, Design, Build, Test framework. That's been applied across 15 different UW ALACRITY studies to redesign both interventions and strategies, including those with and without a digital component. But very briefly, this includes sort of a fact-finding discover phase where you're really learning about three things. You're learning about the setting, the individuals, and the innovation. And often identifying usability issues that are going to feed into your iterative prototyping design build phase, where you're synthesizing all of that and putting together prototypes that you're showing to users. And then you move into the test phase, and after you've met your constraints adequately. And the test phase is really a kind of pilot hybrid effectiveness implementation trial, where you're going out into the real world and also seeing opportunities for almost like in vivo usability testing as you go. One quick note on digital redesign, just because it is often so much part and parcel with human-centered design. Digital redesign is great. And of course, digital or not is not an either or decision. There are plenty of kind of technology-enabled services that may incorporate both digital and human service components. At the ALACRITY Center, we use plenty of digital redesign solutions. Approximately 2/3 of our projects have a digital component, but what we really try to do is avoid defaulting to digital solutions, because even though digital redesign can improve the scale and accessibility of services for some, it can simultaneously limit accessibility for others who may have less internet access or maybe less comfortable working in a digital space. And intervention technologies suffer from adoption and sustainment problems as great, or in some studies even greater than traditional programs. So digital is not an either or decision, and also not a panacea. I've been talking a lot about usability, so I thought I'd define it: the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals in a specified context of use. And usability is pretty important, and we believe, although this is a theoretical relationship here, that usability's importance increases with scale. In the early years of computers, early adopters, people like Bill Gates, had the motivation and expertise to work around the design problems of those early computers that were frankly terrible in terms of their user interface. But they had that knowledge and they had that motivation. The same is true, I think, in a lot of our settings in which we develop some of our evidence-based interventions, that maybe university settings may have exceptionally motivated and skilled graduate students as the first deliverers of them. And that's fine early on, but very quickly after you move out of that, you wind up needing your intervention or implementation strategy to be increasingly usable, because the pool of people who are so motivated and have such expertise to be able to work around all of those usability issues dwindles very rapidly. I also wanted to show how we think about usability overlapping with, what I would term perceptual implementation outcomes. And again, this is ultimately an empirical question, but conceptually, I like to think about usability as more even though it emerges in context, more a property of a particular innovation, but overlapping with things like acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility that are certainly about the intersection of an innovation and a context. This is also reflected here, thinking about usability as a key implementation determinant, sort of upstream, perhaps, Although, again, I'll admit it's an empirical question that we haven't answered yet, to our perceptual implementation outcomes, acceptability, appropriateness, feasibility, our behavioral implementation outcomes, adoption, fidelity, reach, and then ultimately our service outcomes. When I'm talking about usability, I also like to talk about usability testing. And here are a few best practices for usability testing. Explicitly identifying end users, both primary, secondary, and negative users. So primary users are the people whose needs you need to meet. The secondary users are people whose needs you can meet as long as it doesn't interfere with your ability to meet the needs of your sort of well-specified primary users. And negative users are the people that you're not designing for, that you're deliberately not designing for. Because if you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. Prioritizing components for testing, because often it is impossible, especially with some of our complex interventions or strategies, to test every little bit of it. Just like you could never sit down and decide to usability test the entire Windows operating system. There's just too much there. Test authentic versus ideal circumstances, even if they're in a like more of a contrived environment. Create opportunities for users to interact with components rather than just showing them things and asking them what they think. In some ways, this is one reason that I have that little note down at the bottom that focus groups, which are great and very useful, are not usability testing, because they often don't include that interaction, which is often scenario driven and task-based in usability testing. Track user success or failure and qualitatively describe the issues that users encounter. So you want to make sure that you're not testing the ideal condition, but testing real conditions with real folks. I can't see that many of you, but I'd like you all to say this with me. The user is not like me. Now you. I know you're all on mute. I saw a few lips moving. Good. Identification of end users is a key aspect of the articulation of sort of preconditions and what's going to be required for either a strategy or intervention to be an appropriate thing for a person to engage with. Product developers across all domains tend to underestimate user diversity in their design processes. And as a result, base designs on people similar to themselves rather than the range of potential users that they could be considered. However, there's evidence to suggest that clear identification of representative users and their needs can correct this bias, or at least help to. So user identification is a pretty critical step in any usability testing and I think design process overall. I already talked some about primary, secondary, and negative or non-users. But one of the reasons this is all just so important is that clearly knowing who you've identified as your users and then essentially working on their behalf is one sort of step to developing some of the empathy for your users that I was talking about initially as sort of an objective of some of these human-centered design processes. That can be done through things like personas, which are data-driven sort of archetypes of potential users. And the whole reason personas are used is to elicit that sort of empathy and a certain degree of understanding among people who might be on a design team. User identification is even potentially more important. I work almost exclusively in youth-oriented services who are likely to have a larger set of primary users as a function of both caregiver and other important adult involvement in their lives. So usability evaluation methods are pretty diverse. They can range, and these are sort of in ascending order of complexity and ultimately cost, but from things that are quantitative instruments. We've developed something we call the intervention usability scale, which is just an adaptation of the very well-established system usability scale for digital technologies. There's heuristic evaluation, which is evaluation by experts and allows people to evaluate any given product relative to a set of design principles or heuristics. There's cognitive walkthroughs where people aren't necessarily interacting as directly with a product, but are walking through and figuring out, okay, what are the bottlenecks? Where are the points where what I'm seeing sort of are misaligned with my internal mental models and expectations. There's lab-based usability testing where you bring someone in and have specific tasks structured perhaps within scenarios and have people walk through those tasks and try to achieve a particular goal and see whether they're able to be successful or not. There's in vivo usability testing where you would actually deploy something. This requires a certain amount of implementation in order to see where things are going right or going wrong. I mean, I think that things can be done within something like in vivo testing. You could implement something to a certain degree on a small scale and evaluate even something like fidelity, but you're not evaluating fidelity to see how competent a person is. You're evaluating fidelity to see how well the intervention is able to support them in context. And components of an intervention that might not have high fidelity might be those components that would be appropriate to consider for redesign. So when you're doing usability testing, a lot of what can come out of it are usability issues. These are sort of specific aspects of an innovation or the demand on a user that make it unpleasant, inefficient, onerous, or impossible for the user to achieve their goals. At the UW ALACRITY Center, we've laid out some specific components of usability issues. First is a description or problem statement, sort of like a qualitative description of the usability issue. And for that, we want people to include information about when the problem occurs, for which components of an intervention it occurs, for which users, what the problem is, and what are the consequences of that intervention. And then we have a few other pieces of the way we've across the 15 different UW ALACRITY projects, the different ways that they also sort of augment that by describing the severity. It's like, how bad are these consequences? Is it just sort of annoying, or is it like totally catastrophic, or even like in an intense example, even potentially life-threatening? How often does it happen? Does it happen across different components? Does it happen across different users? Complexity, do we understand the cause and how to fix it? Is it lower complexity and easier to overcome or to address? And then evidence, what evidence supports the above from either your user testing and the literature, et cetera. Doing this, we've so far identified 72 discrete intervention and implementation strategy usability issues. And this is just sort of from a Miro board where we were organizing them. Different colors represent different projects. Just as an example, here's one by a project led by Karen Bears and Jill Locke, focused on the redesign of an intervention, a parenting intervention for kids on the autism spectrum for use by teachers in schools. And you see here that they've described it as individualized visual supports, core component of Ruby, that's the intervention, require a lot of time to develop. They called this a level 2, that it created significant delay and frustration. The scope was that 7 of the 8 participating teachers experienced this issue. It was low complexity because they felt it could be addressed by a template for individualized visual supports. And their evidence came from these in-classroom observations of people using the intervention, as well as semi-structured interviews. A few general caveats related to usability issue articulation. We found that some teams have struggled to articulate usability problems as being issues with the intervention or implementation strategy. Sometimes I think it's easy to default to articulating usability issues as a problem with the user. So sometimes we get that and we need to flip it on its head, because it's really that our interventions and our strategies aren't meeting people's needs. And then in some circumstances, because of that, we've had to sort of conduct multiple iterations on usability issues, which can sometimes slow research timelines. But usability testing itself can be completed relatively quickly and help to present the need for downstream changes. It's sort of a mantra of the human-centered design community that you should test early and test often, because when you get this, because it's much easier to get this information on the front end and make changes than to have a completely sort of like perfected version of your thing and then need to go back and make a lot of changes, which is always more expensive. So building on the usability issues that we've collected, we placed them into 12 different usability issue categories. I won't go through all of these, but they came from our methods core team engaging in a qualitative consensus coding process to identify the most common groupings of these issues. So it might be things like they're cognitively or cognitively overwhelming or too complex, that the intervention or strategy was really too overwhelming for the user or interventionist. Time required. This is a little different than, what's the most common implementation determinant across studies and across projects and domains and users. Time, right? But this is a little bit different because this is that the intervention or implementation strategy demands more time than available, especially even within a particular interaction, in a clinical interaction, if there simply isn't time to fit in some of these practices. So it's a little bit different than just, I don't have enough time to do anything or make a change. Incompatibility with interventionist preferences or practices, that it wasn't a good fit with how an interventionist prefers or has been trained to work and to deliver interventions. Incompatibility with workflow, insufficient customization, and the list goes on and on. One that I want to focus on just for a second is that sort of over-reliance on technology, that there are some interventions or strategies that rely on technology that creates barriers for some clinicians or recipients, or that isn't available to all clients or recipients, as well as requires unavailable infrastructure, that the intervention or strategy requires some sort of physical system or organizational infrastructure that wasn't available. One example for a school-based project was that there was sort of an assumption, an intervention was sort of built with an assumption that there was what we call in the school world multi-tiered systems of support in place and functioning well, which there might not be. And that could be a usability issue for a particular intervention that makes that assumption. For those who don't work in schools, the MTSS approach is really just sort of a school-focused version of the public health model with kind of universal and selected and indicated kinds of interventions. So we took those categories and we turned them into a set of design heuristics, with those being that well-designed interventions or strategies have low cognitive load, efficiently use time, are responsive to existing practices, are responsive to existing system constraints, are flexible and adaptable, demonstrate value, sort of engenders satisfaction and trust, avoids technology choices that can exclude, require minimal infrastructure, is learnable for both recipients and interventionists, and enhances communication and feedback. So now, I would like, I can't see many of you, but for those that I can, a show of hands. If you've ever worried that your implementation strategy wasn't readily scalable beyond your immediate system. Oh, thanks for coming on camera, folks. Okay, I'm seeing a few, I've seen some hands up. If anyone, practitioner, organizational administrator, research collaborator, has ever suggested that your implementation strategy was too cumbersome. Some hands there as well. Real and virtual hands, good. If you want to make sure that your implementation strategy is applicable and accessible across a range of different user groups. Lots of hands there too. So that's the goal of this just example method I'm going to run through really quick, that we call the cognitive walkthrough for implementation strategies. And this is really a usability evaluation method that then can produce usability issues that can be the foundation for strategy redesign. Simply put, We have our first stage where we're determining necessary preconditions. Those are sort of like, what do people need to know, or who are the users that you might be designing a strategy for. Like, we applied this to we applied it in a few different situations now, but one of them was to a post-training consultation strategy. And some of the preconditions were just that someone needed to do the initial training, that this was going to follow, or that they were going to be, in our case, school-based mental health providers who are working directly with students. Next is a task analysis, where we try to specify all the different components of the strategy. And I mean, I forget exactly how many it was for our post-training consultation strategy, but I think we probably had 20 to 30 unique tasks. And you can kind of articulate these by going through sort of iteratively with your team, writing out all the tasks you can think of, and then sort of asking yourself, okay, well, what happens before that? What happens after that? To try to have as comprehensive a set as possible, knowing that you're not going to be doing something with every single one of those tasks. Then we have the task prioritization, where we actually had members of our team rate different tasks in terms of the likelihood that someone was going to have a problem with it, and that they were going to and that it was a task that was critical to the functioning or success of the strategy. We turned those top tasks into some testing scenarios that themselves sort of had, it wasn't exactly a one-to-one relationship, but that had particular tasks, sometimes it was, that we were going to ask people to complete or to think through in a group, because this isn't lab-based usability testing. This is sort of one level abstracted from that. So we actually do this in the context of group testing, where we bring people together, present a particular task, have everyone independently rate their likelihood that they would know what to do, be able to do it successfully, and then know that they did it right. Once they had done that independently, we had people go around and share essentially their rationale for the ratings that they gave. So you both get information individually from people, and you allow for a certain amount of group process that you can feed into a qualitative coding process. And it's through that we really I sort of specify our usability issues and classify and prioritize them. So you can read more about it in the paper referenced there, but just wanted to kind of give a more concrete example of the way that some of these things can play out. This is, of course, just one example of one method that's sort of drawing from some of the techniques and thinking that I've been talking about so far today. One thing I want to also be sure to include are some persistent human-centered design and maybe implementation science tensions too. And I'm sure these aren't the only ones. These are just the ones that I've observed and that I happened to write down when I was putting together these slides. But I think it's important, especially when we're sort of examining other fields, to not just sort of think, oh, well, they've got this all figured out. Of course they don't. What do any of us really have figured out? But there are certainly useful things there. And I think it's nice to be able to learn from where other fields are in terms of grappling with some of their sticky issues. One of this is universality versus context dependence of design solutions, right? There's this notion of universal design, and that's picked up in a few different places. It's also something in education that's meant to sort of create kind of more inclusive learning environments. This is a little separate from that. And there's this question of how attainable is universal design. The notion that some design features, some design decisions, etc., can be applied across all groups of people. Every time you start to make assumptions that your design solutions or anything really are applicable to all people, it's probably a good opportunity to check some of your assumptions for who you're including in your implicit or otherwise conceptualization of all people. And I don't know whether there is truly such a thing as universal design, or unless that universal design includes sort of explicitly designed opportunities for tailoring, which itself is a design solution and can be a fine one. Is more engagement with a product always better? There's been a long-standing sort of assumption within human-centered design, and probably within a lot of our work within implementation, that more is better, that we're seeking greater engagement, more minutes, more hours over a longer period of time. And that's success, and that's what engagement is. But is that really true? There's some emerging discussion now within human-centered design about the sort of quantity versus quality of engagement, and how well or completely is someone invested when they are interfacing with something in it, and sort of like, you know, making effective use of it, versus just doing it more and more and more. And of course, since time winds up being a zero-sum game, more and more and more is not necessarily the right thing that we should be after. How much influence do users have in ultimate design solutions? There are all sorts of power structures that still exist within human-centered design, and exist everywhere within our world as human beings. Within the user-centered design world, there's really a need to balance users' knowledge and ideas with designers' knowledge and ideas, typically, simply because there's efficiencies to be had. And I think it's important to make the point that although design is often participatory, human-centered design is not CBPR, community-based participatory research. Historically, human-centered design works very hard to gather perspectives from users, and may even have some representation of certain user groups on a design team. But it is not the full power sharing that I think CBPR suggests and really kind of requires at every step along the way. I haven't seen that very frequently in human-centered design. And I think it's an important point to make, especially when we're talking about all these kinds of strategies for getting users' perspectives. I think it's easy to begin to say, oh, well, we're doing this sort of community-based participatory process. It's like, yes, but not at the level that I think would satisfy people who are firmly rooted in something like a CBPR tradition. And can human-centered design help to improve health equity? I mean, this is, I think, a question a lot of people ask. People say, well, we have these user engagement processes, so that's going to help, right? And I think the answer to that is maybe. But you know, inequities in healthcare often occur as a result of inadequate understanding or incorporation of user needs. That's true. That's certainly like one determinant, let's say, of inequities. A core principle of human-centered design is that stakeholders are in the best position to communicate their needs to design teams, and this is often achieved via explicit identification of user characteristics. I was talking about that earlier. Okay, so maybe there's a little something there. Early contextual inquiry can help avoid some equity-related pitfalls by surfacing information about the destination setting, needs, and can serve as a foundation for local innovation, design, or redesign. Human-centered design can support equity goals by improving the contextual appropriateness and cultural responsiveness of innovations. Okay, there's some potential there. But without some re-examination, I don't think human-centered design is likely to get there. I love this quote, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. Despite human-centered design's framing as a collaborative approach with end users, power structures are insidious to its practice history. Indeed, the potential for the development of the following power structure is rampant in human-centered design. A designer, often a cisgender, heterosexual white male, attempting to uncover the needs of a marginalized user and or community to create a product. Marginalized users and communities may often already have strong notions of what might work for them and do not need these ideas to be uncovered for them. Very well said. That's why I'm just saying it the way they said it. I mean, it's an excellent point, and not unique necessarily to human-centered design, but certainly very much present within human-centered design. And they went on and said, we cannot promote this group of human-centered design approaches as a means to promote equity in interventions without explicitly acknowledging that it has historically not been used in this way and will not be used for equity without purposeful and continued scrutiny of its practice. So some potential, and like so many other domains, a long way to go if we really want to work in alignment with, I mean, at least many of our values. And that's, you know, that's the ongoing fight. So to return to my main points, the world is designed and can be better designed. Human-centered design and implementation science have overlapping objectives, do it a little differently. There are opportunities to better integrate human-centered design to enhance impact, and plenty of things left to figure out. So that's what I've got. Thank you very much. And I think we probably have time for a few questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron. That was such a nice deep dive and overview. I feel like it clarified so many misperceptions that I've had about human-centered design and implementation science.
Oh, good.